Family values is another phrase for conservative values. They do not necessarily reflect the values of all families. So when you hear the phrase family values in the media or in the news, make sure you note that difference, that when we talk about family values, we're talking about conservative traditional values. So what other values may not be represented by conservative ideals? Take a minute and think about this. This is a really important question when considering challenges to conservative ideals. What are really the huge value judgments that differentiate conservatives from liberals? When I think about the differences between family values or traditional values and liberal values, what I think about often is flexibility and openness. And certainly you have experienced this in your life. Some people that really truly value just being honest, being open, being real, being raw, and also being flexible and tolerant and inquisitive. And so this sort of openness is really common amongst liberals. And you can see that these types of values are something that is really deep-seated. And it doesn't mean that if you value family values and you value tradition, that you can't be open, and if you value openness, it doesn't mean that you can't also be traditional and respectful. But I think that there is sort of a juxtaposition between these ideas, and it's important to look at that. After President Clinton's presidency, there's a huge movement for change. In 1997, we can start to see the origins of this change. The Kyoto Agreement was an international treaty that extended the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This Kyoto Agreement was a very big deal, though. What it did was it committed the countries that were at this agreement, or that are participating in this international treaty, to reduce greenhouse gases emissions based on the premise that A, global warming exists, and man-made CO2 emissions have caused it. So it wasn't until 1997 that we were really willing to accept these two premises, that global warming was happening. And so many people might be able to acknowledge that it is happening, but they weren't willing to acknowledge part B, which is that human beings are causing global warming. Since there has been overwhelming scientific evidence to support this and scientific research, and it's pretty much not a disputed thing anymore. However, the last 2 or 3 decades have been really controversial over this particular topic, and there are still a large number of people in our country that do not believe that global warming exists, so they haven't even accepted Part A. But the United States does participate in this international treaty, the Kyoto Agreement, and they do feel strongly that the United States has caused this. Another major signal of change was the 2000 election. Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, won the popular vote in the 2000 election, and George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, who was president after Reagan, won the Electoral College. The fate of the entire election was on one swing state, Florida, and ultimately, the election was settled in the courts, and George W. Bush became the victor in this particular case. And this is an interesting thing. It's always been very difficult for vice presidents to win elections. That's just sort of an interesting political phenomenon. And so that's sort of a component here. But one of the reasons why this election was so fascinating, it's fascinating from a legal perspective about how do we decide who the president is going to be, especially given that Al Gore won the popular vote. And so this could be a pretty big criticism of the Electoral College. But It's also a fascinating election because of the role of and impact of third parties. The Green Party is traditionally a pretty liberal party. They're an environmentalist party, and they're sort of like a single issue party, talking about the environment and sustainability. The Green Party candidate, Ralph Nader, basically took away Al Gore's liberal base and arguably lost him the election. Ralph Nader got 2% of the popular vote, which in the big term, this is not a significant amount. However, 2% in an election where it's going to be settled by that narrow of a margin is pretty significant. And so Ralph Nader arguably lost in the election. But what it did was, and this is important, Democrats never made the mistake since to not lean towards those sustainable environmental people and to keep your base happy, basically. The Green Party had been pretty upset under Clinton, happy with the Kyoto Agreement, but maybe not super happy with other policies that were leaning more towards big business and less towards the environment. Gore, since the 2000 election, has campaigned on behalf of the environment, but he has never run for office again. So major change is underway. President Bush's presidency is a major victory and continuation of conservative ideals and values. But the bulk of President Bush's presidency is really focused on the war in Iraq, and those are some of the major criticisms and praises of President Bush is the war in Iraq. And so it's sort of a different theme. But change is brewing, and you can feel it early in 2000. Conservatives brought a return to American values, 2 wars, but also an unstable economy. Spending money on 2 wars is a lot of money to spend, and we reduced regulation on the stock market and other things. There were also environmental concerns that were growing, and people were becoming more and more concerned with that, especially when we're talking about sustainability and the fact that sustainable energy and renewable energy will get us away from dependence on foreign oil. And there were also several major social movements that were brewing. The Great Recession of 2008 was arguably larger than the Great Depression, but the government bailout package that Bush and Obama both put into place prevented its impact. So that is an argument in favor of government intervention in the economy, similar to what we did during the New Deal. Some economists, though, they're called Keynesian economists, and they're often libertarian in political philosophy, worry that the Great Recession of 2008 and the government's treatment of that recession is just sort of stalling the inevitable, and predict that another major recession is going to happen, and we might continue to keep bailing it out, but eventually the bailouts won't work. Regardless, Americans were sick of unsustainable policies domestically and abroad, and change did happen. So one of the first things that I like to do before we get into talking about President Obama and some of the changes is think about how all of this relates to same-sex marriage. So I have a song that I'd like you to watch the music video for. It's called Same Love by Macklemore. What are some of the points that he makes in this song, and why did he choose this type of musicality? How does the music influence your feelings about this particular issue? So when we're talking about same-sex marriage, this is a major social movement that happens under, sort of this wave of change that's occurring, is discussions about homosexuality and maybe just sexuality in general. You can see in the chart that's pictured here, this is a Gallup poll. Gallup polls are known, they're sort of a major private company that just polls Americans on popular opinion about a variety of options and issues. So this question is asking Americans, do you believe that the origins of homosexuality are innate or environmental? Environmental meaning you believe that people become homosexuality rather than being born with born a homosexual. And you can see that the percentages of people believing this is actually getting more and more intertwined as you get into like 2002-ish on the chart. And so there are a lot of people that believe that it is very distinct, and then people are becoming closer and believe that it's a little bit of both. Still debated today is whether sexual orientation is something you are born with, which would make discrimination illegal. An immutable characteristic is something that our federal government is required to protect. Immutable characteristics are things that cannot change. So things like your gender, things like your race, you cannot change those things. Others have made connections that you cannot change your religion, and which obviously that is a little bit different, but still the same freedoms and protections have been applied to religion. So still debated today is whether or not sexual orientation is something that is immutable, and if it is immutable, which most psychologists argue that it is, if it is immutable, it would definitely be considered discrimination. And so it's a matter of sort of convincing the government that most Americans believe it's immutable. The American Psychological Association has come out and said that homosexuality is a normal form of sexuality. If unalienable or unchangeable, gay marriage would have to pass nationally because it would most certainly be discrimination. So many people have then begun to question, okay, perhaps we can't discriminate against homosexuals, but perhaps we can bar them from marriage. And this is a really interesting thing, and it gets into the question is, what is the purpose of marriage? And those that are opposed to homosexuals having access to marriage have argued that the reason our government is in the quote-unquote business of handing out marriages is to protect children. Governments have a pretty compelling interest in making sure that children are protected. We see this pretty early on as governments are putting in protective actions to protect children from child labor and different things like that. And they see marriage as no different. Governments are, and part of sort of these conservative ideas and family values is to protect marriage, to make sure that families remain intact, to get away from divorce statistics and other things like that. And so the government has intervened and plays a major role in divorces. They get to decide who gets custody of kids and things like that. And so since homosexuals can't biologically create a child together, many people have argued that that marriage is not something that can extend to homosexuals because it's getting away. You can be in a relationship, nobody's keeping you from doing that, but it's getting away from what the purpose of marriage is, which is to protect children. Now, this argument has some shortcomings, and as you can see, Time magazine is arguing that gay marriage has already won, even though the Supreme Court hasn't fully passed gay marriage. For example, sterile and uninterested heterosexuals can still get married. So if you're uninterested in having children, you can still get married, and the government still allows you to do that. If you cannot have children because you're sterile, the government will allow you to get married. So couples can be married and never have children ever, and the government will still endorse those marriages. So perhaps marriage is more than just about the rearing of children. Perhaps marriage is something a little bit different. Interestingly, single people can adopt, and there is not a lot of government regulation in regards to that. And homosexuals can adopt children, even though they're not married. So there's no requirement that you be married, although it is a plus when you're trying to adopt, but there's no requirement that you be married. So, and we also see a major rise in homosexual couples adopting children together. And this is really interesting because those children are not getting the same legal protections that children who have legally married parents do. For example, if you are legally married and have children, you get a tax break from the government. And so the government is rewarding you for being legally married. Children of homosexual couples do not necessarily get those same federal tax breaks, and that's an interesting thing. So it's actually, in some ways, damaging the lives of children. So here is a map as of very recently of where same-sex marriage is allowed in our country. So everything in dark purple, same-sex marriage is allowed there. New Hampshire is one of those states and has been for a very long time. In the sort of like lighter purple are states where it could be allowed pending on some legal action. So there is change brewing in those places as of 2015. And the states that are in tan, same-sex marriage is still banned. So there's some background on this, though, because it doesn't just start here in 2015. In 1969, there were some riots known as the Stonewall Riots. What happened was police raided a gay bar, or at the time it was called a fag bar. Protests and riots ensued. The incident became a symbol for oppression of the LGBT community. It was the first time, and LGBT, by the way, stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender peoples. And it's sort of a common acronym that's used to sort of combine that group of people, even though those groups are not necessarily, there's the issues there with sexuality are a little bit different, and their concerns with sexuality are a little bit different, but the four groups there have sort of been lumped together by maybe the biased heterosexual white male audience that is running our world, and also just because they are all arguing for sexual freedoms of sorts. So this incident, the Stonewall Riots, become a symbol for oppression by the LGBT community, and it's the first time that lesbian, gays, bis, and transsexuals are standing up, and transgenders are standing up for their rights and resisting the oppression, and this is a really big deal. Stonewall was the first time that I saw in a public way my community fighting back. This was Donna Redwing. She was a national field director for the Human Rights Campaign in 1999. And this is her recalling seeing the Stonewall Riots in the news. This, you can obviously see, is some of the unwillingness to sort of accept homosexuality. So just looking at the title, it says, Homo Nest Raided. Queen bees are stinging mad. They're talking here about some drag queens who were part of the Stonewall Riots. But this title to this article shows a little bit about the bias and the perception of what homosexuality was during this time in the late 1960s. Harvey Milk is also an important component here, and an important sort of landmark figure in the gay rights movement. He was the first openly gay public official. He was elected in San Francisco, California, and assassinated, and his assassination led to a lot of riots by gay rights activists in 1978. Here's an interesting quote from Harvey Milk. He said, "It takes no compromising to give people their rights. It takes no money to respect the individual." So basically there he's trying to break down any opposition to gay rights, saying we don't have to compromise, just give people their rights. You don't have to, give up anything to respect individual people. And I think this is an interesting piece. Harvey Milk appeared maybe perhaps more quote unquote normal to many people, because he wasn't, he wasn't a drag queen. He wasn't sort of what people thought of as the stereotypical gay person, flamboyant and otherwise. And so perhaps he gave the gay rights movement a better name as a result of that amongst the heterosexual community. So procon.org has an interesting site for understanding controversial issues, and there's a great deal of information on the pros and cons of not only homosexuality and whether or not homosexuality should be listed as discrimination, but also same-sex marriage, and I encourage you to look into the procon.org website. In 2013, there was a landmark Supreme Court case that really changes the dynamic and sways the tide in favor of gay rights. Edith Winsor, it was a lesbian woman, sued the United States government So many years of protests and movements go on from 1978. There's obviously some backlash from the conservative community, things like the Defense of Marriage Act and other things that are passed. And so a major landmark case related to gay rights happened in 2013, and this case was called U.S. v. Winsor. Edith Winsor sued the United States government. She had been legally married in her state to her spouse. She was taxed by the federal government on her inheritance from her spouse after the spouse died. So she wasn't taxed by her state, but she was taxed by the federal government because the federal government did not recognize her marriage, whereas her state government did. So because there was actually monetary damages here, and that's the tricky part, you have to prove that there were damages in civil cases, and so not anybody can just sue. You have to demonstrate that you have been discriminated against in some way, and so here was an opportunity for Edith Winsor to do that, and so she did. In 2013, Winsor won in a 5-4 decision at the Supreme Court. Here she is, pictured pretty happy. Note that this is a 5-4 decision, so it's a pretty close decision that the Supreme Court made. And what this Supreme Court decision did was it struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, basically saying that the federal government cannot pass laws that undercut state laws, and also that this act was inherently discriminatory because it taxed her more than it taxed a heterosexual couple. Edith Winsor, in her own words, described the situation. She was saying, if I had been married to some man and I had met him months before he died and he died and left me money, I would not have been taxed. But I loved and cared for this woman for many, many years and was taxed on that. And that's to paraphrase, but that's the gist of what she said. So the Defense of Marriage Act activity gives you an opportunity to look at the Defense of Marriage Act itself, and it gives you an opportunity to look at the verdict and also some conservative opposition to the verdict in relation to Edith Winsor v. United States.